is how can the right to self-determination be realized for indigenous peoples in Asia, exploring enabling conditions from the perspective of indigenous peoples. This side event is being jointly organized by the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, the Diplomacy Training Australia, and the Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defenders Network Asia. So for these webinars, I think it is important to remind ourselves as to what was the or is the original intent and spirit of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As you would recall, this initiative and this recognition and adoption of this declaration is really in the backdrop of the fact that international community began to realize that there are other peoples apart from the nation states. They are part of the international UN processes. So with this recognition, also with the realization that there is a need to reduce conflict, violence, and bloodshed around the globe. And it is for this reason that the UN Declaration was adopted. Therefore, it initiated a type of moral reform processes in the human rights standard setting and human rights mechanisms. And that is why the expert mechanisms, the UN Permanent Forum, the Special Rapporteur, etc., has been created as part of this reform process. However, the problem is that this same intent and the spirit and the principles is not applied at the national level by the governments. And therefore, it has been left unaddressed in the way that it should have been addressed, and therefore conflict, violence, and violation of human rights continues. And the issue of indigenous peoples have continued to be treated as a threat to national security or territorial integrity and so on. The reality is that all indigenous peoples are today, we find ourselves to be encapsulated within the state system. And therefore there is a need to resolve this issue in collaboration, cooperation with the states. And that is really the challenge. And this UN DRIP, and in particular, the right to self-determination, has been rather seen as a threat and is not seen as a means to be able to resolve these conflicts and also lead to democratization and the kind of reform that is needed for a more peaceful and just society. And therefore, on the other hand, we continue to see, and the rate of the shrinking of civic space have really increased over these past few years across the globe, particularly in Asia. This means that the civil society organizations and the public in general are not able to use the existing political institutions and spaces to reduce or to negotiate or resolve conflicts and be able to address pressing democratic issues within their own countries. Now, as we can see that this is affecting the larger polity and society. So it's not just about indigenous peoples. So the question is also then, how do we use this UN DRIP and how do we use this issue of indigenous peoples that can lead to the kind of reform that is needed at this point of time to bring about more justice and more peaceful polity in our own countries and therefore democratization. So in all this, perhaps there is a need for a new perspective and also new approach that is looking at more proactive approach and also joint problem solving between states and indigenous peoples and civil society and so on, to be able to transform and transcend these challenges that we are faced with today, globally speaking, and particularly in Asia. So in doing this side event is really aimed at understanding some of the issues and challenges that is going through in Asia. And in particular, we have picked up 4 countries. So we'll be looking at the cases from these 4 countries where there has been a number of peace accords or some form of constructive agreements between indigenous peoples and states. But yet these things are not moving forward, and it's not leading to peace and justice. So therefore, to understand what are the barriers and enabling conditions, by understanding those things, how can we perhaps change this stagnated scenario that we are all confronted with today. And today we have very interesting list of panelists who would be sharing their experiences and also their knowledge in order to be able to help us understand and look at what could be the potentially the way forward in addressing this very crucial and important issue. Now, to begin with, we are fortunate to have Vinota Moidhamai, who is the member of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples from Asia. And he would be briefly sharing to us some highlights of the EMRIP's report on the self-determination that they have just conducted. It is at the draft stage, but and also what are the potential next steps that the EMRIP can do in taking forward this issue of right to self-determination of indigenous peoples. So welcome, Vinota, please take the floor.
Kulumka, greetings in my language. Thank you, AIPP, International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, IGIA, our very well-known organization, and the Diplomacy Training Program from Australia for organizing this very timely, relevant, and important side event, and inviting me as one of the speakers. It's really an honor and privilege. EMRIP, as part of the mandate, UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is the core focus of its works. So rights to self-determination is linked to all the study and report that has undertaken by the EMRIP since its inception. However, this year we have especially focused on the right to self-determination. So just very briefly, I'd like to share what is in the report. Our report on the right to self-determination explores how this right has developed since the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It notes that the definition of self-determination in the UN Declaration follows other international and regional instruments in how it defines the right to self-determination. It embodies the right for all peoples to determine their own economic, social, and cultural development. So the report speaks to the history of the right to self-determination, including in the decolonization context. It sets out the legal framework and ways and means in which indigenous peoples express their right to self-determination. It also explores many challenges, including the regional differences in the implementation of the right, the dangers of conflating self-determination with the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent, the imposition of self-determination by the state rather than indigenous peoples themselves, and the false dichotomy of internal and external self-determination. Our report focused on the relationship between the right to self-determination and citizenship, cultural heritage, sports, and languages is also covered in the report. The report exemplifies the interconnectedness of the foundational right to self-determination and other human rights, including the rights to participation, consultation, and land rights. The report builds on EMRIP's earlier reports, in particular our recent report on land rights and free, prior, and informed consent, both of which highlighted the nature of self-determination as the right upon which other rights are grounded. Our report has concluded with recommendations for both states and indigenous peoples, highlighting the direct correlation between the extent of recognition of indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples by states and the extent to which states respect, protect, and fulfill their right to self-determination. So this report we can utilize in many ways. One is that to follow up those recommendations and work together in achieving the right of self-determination. So when I said follow up, it means the recommendations it has placed and how we can make it contextualized and realized on the ground. This is the important part. That's where the support and also initiatives from the indigenous peoples organizations, civil societies, national human rights institutions are very important. In another note, we are currently in the process of finalizing our thematic study and report. I'm sure you might be excited to hear about this. The study we are most probably undertaking is the treaties and constructive arrangement and include ongoing process on finding a constitutional basis for implementing treaties. That's our currently finalizing process for the study of next year. And the report for the next year we are preparing is the militarization on indigenous peoples, land, and territories. So what I'd like to share here today with IGIA, DTP, and AIPP is that I know you are committed in advancing indigenous people's rights and advocacy, but I look forward to the cooperation in the future from the Asia regional perspective that is particularly relevant to AIPP also by conducting a seminar and workshop on those particular study and report for the contribution from the Asia regional perspective to the expert mechanism. So this is by saying this, I'd like to conclude here. But before that, I'd like to say that I apologize that I have to leave the meeting because we are having our closed door meeting now. Actually has already started at 6. I mean 10 a.m. in Geneva time, so I'm a bit late. So even though I'm interested to hear your statement, but I'm sorry that I have to leave now. And once again, I would like to thank you, the organizers, AIPP, IGIA, and Diplomacy Training Program, DTP, for inviting me and also give me the chance sharing my thoughts. And also I wish you a very best meeting and productive outcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vinota, for sharing those very important information. And also your future studies, those things are very relevant. And also as a way of informing also the participants as well as to Vinota is that we intend to submit these recommendations that will come out of this webinar. And we look forward to further collaboration and working with the EMRIP. And those suggestions that you have made are very well taken for all the organizers of this webinar. But before you go, also, I think it is appropriate. I just got the information, even though you did not inform me, that you have been elected as the vice chair of EMRIP. So I would really like to congratulate you on behalf of these organizers and the participants who are attending this webinar. So congratulations, Vinota, for being elected as the vice chair. I think it will do very well in promoting the issues of indigenous peoples in Asia in particular. So congratulations and thank you very much. Okay. So we move on with the next speaker now. Our next speaker is Mangal Kumar Chakma. He is the Information and Publicity Secretary of the Bharatiya Chatgram Jana Samhati Samiti, PCJSS. I think that's easier to say, from Bangladesh. So we have him, and then of course I would like to put forward a question to you, Mangal.
Yes.
What we have been hearing from Bangladesh is that even though the accord, the CHT accord, or the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord has been signed in 1997, that is 23 years ago, and the government claims that most of the provisions of this accord has been implemented, but your organization and also the people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts have been saying exactly the opposite, by saying that the government is actually ignoring the implementation of this accord. And we have seen that there has been very widespread protests, and also militarization continues to be in your region. Can you explain why this is so?
Thank you, Gam. Thank you, EIPP and IPGIA, and also DTP for organizing this important side event. Like other countries of Asia, in Bangladesh, the biggest challenges to the implementation of indigenous people right to self-determination is the state denial of people concerned as indigenous peoples and non-implementation of agreement or constructive arrangement signed between the state and the indigenous people. One of the prime examples in Asia is the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord. Despite signing the CST Accord in 1997, with a view to resolving the CST problem through political and peaceful means, the government has not come forward to implement the accord properly and fully as of now. As a result, even after 23 years of signing of the accord, the fundamental provision of the accord remain unimplemented. The political solution to the CST problem has not been achieved. The right to self-determination of indigenous Jummo people has not been established. However, in order to confuse the public opinion at home and abroad and cover up the government failure to implement the accord, Bangladesh government is propagating that out of 72 provisions, 2/3 provision of the accord have been implemented. In fact, only 2/3 provision of, only 1/3 provision of implemented as of today. The 2/3 provision has not implemented properly, have not been implemented properly. In particular, the fundamental provisions are either completely unrealized or have been partially implemented. For example, one of the provision of the self-governance in the Chittagong Hill Tract is to introduce a special governance system consisting of CST Regional Council and 3 Hill District Council. Although the laws of this council were enacted after the signing of the accord as per the accord, but the subject of general administration, law and order, police, land and land management, forest, environment, etc., have not been handed over to this council as of today. Election for the 3 Hill District Council have not held in last. This council are being run undemocratically by appointing the people from the party in power. For demilitarization of the region, the CST Accord provides for the withdrawal of all temporary camps from the CST. However, only around 100 camps out of the more than 500 temporary camps have been withdrawn so far. In addition, the government imposed Operation Uttaran, Operation Upliftment, de facto military rule in CST in 2001. By virtue of this military rule, the government have been controlling and interfering in all matters of the CST, such as general administration, law and order, judiciary, development activities, etc., and have been continuing obstruction of the implementation of CST Accord. Besides, resolution of land dispute, cancellation of land leases illegally given to the outsider, rehabilitation of India returning Jammu refugees, internally displaced families, preservation of tribal inhabited status of CST region, amendment of laws applicable in CST, etc., remain fully unimplemented. At present, the government has completely stopped the implementation process in the CST Accord. Instead of a political solution to the CST problem through implementation of CST Accord, the government has currently chosen the path of military solution through repression in the fascist style. The army have been conducting raid, arbitrary arrests, inhuman beating, harassment against the individual and organization vocal for the implementation of the CST Accord, including PCCSS member and supporter in every day. I think in this scenario, the major obstacle to the implementation of the CST Accord and establishment of self-determination of the Jammu people are the undemocratic and communal attitude of the government and the political leadership of Bangladesh, militarization in the CST, and imposition of de facto military rule, Operation Uttran, the role of military and civilian brocade against the CST Accord and against the interests of the Jammu people. This is the actual status of implementation of CST Accord and situation in the CST. Thank you.
Thank you, Mangal, for explaining as to why you feel that Accord has been ignored. And you have explained that self-governance has not really been implemented, and the government continues to control the law and order situation, resource management, and economic development, etc. And also the land disputes issues have not been settled and military operations continue. And then you have also pointed out that communal attitude and the military approach is some of the major barriers and hurdles. Nevertheless, you also mentioned that this is a constructive agreement otherwise. So in this context, what would be your recommendation or to governments or to us in terms of how this accord, which you are calling it a constructive agreement, to be translated into an instrument for realizing the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples of the Chittagong Hill Tracts?
Okay. In this context, I would like to make some recommendation for the establishment of right of self-determination of the Jammu people in particular and indigenous people in general, in light of the Article 3 and 4 of UNDRIP. To the EMRIP1 to conduct an assessment study of the CST Accord, particularly CST Accord, and in general the Accord and constructive arrangements between the government and indigenous people, to know the progress, identify challenges and gaps in the implementation. Second, to motivate the government of Bangladesh through the United Nations bodies and agencies concerned to implement the recommendation of UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues adopted in 2011 on implementation of CST Accord, and recommendation of UPR and concluding observation of the UN treaty monitoring bodies. Now I like to recommend to the government of Bangladesh, one, to withdraw all temporary camp, including Operation Uttaran from the CST, to facilitate right to self-determination and demilitarization of the CST region. Second, to execute CST Regional Council Act and Tree Hill District Council Act properly, pertaining to transfer of general administration, law and order, police, land and land management, forest and environment, etc., and to hold election of this council by preparing voter lists with permanent resident of Tree Hill District Council. Third, to expedite resolution of land dispute by finalizing and adopting the draft rule of 2016 of the CST Land Commission without further delay. Fourth, to rehabilitate Bengali settlers who were settled in CST in 1980s outside CST with dignity. Five, to amend laws and regulations applicable in CST, such as CST Regulation of 1900, Police Act of 1861, Police Regulation, CST Land Acquisition Act of 1958, Forest Act of 1927, etc., to make them in consonance with the CST Accord. This is my recommendation for EMRIP and the government of Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mangal, for sharing your thoughts and also those very important recommendations. So thank you once again. Now we move on to the next panel. The next panel is Akam Longkumar. He's a member of the Naga People's Movement for Human Rights from Northeast part of India. So Akam, I also would like to ask you this question, that there has been numerous peace accords signed between the indigenous peoples in Northeast India with government of India. But these accords have not ushered in peace and justice in the region. The continuing problems of militarization and repression continues in that region. Now, why do you think that this is the reason behind this failure of all these accords that we see in Northeast India?
Okay, so thank you, first of all, organizers, for giving us this opportunity to speak. I'm sure we all know that numerous peace accords have been signed, right? In fact, 14 peace accords have been signed between the government of India and the various indigenous peoples of the northeast of India, right? But the Indian state's definition of peace and the spirit of these accords continue to be problematic for all indigenous people. Let me just recount how many different peace accords have been signed. See, the Bodo Accords have been signed, 3 of them. The most recent of which was in January 2020, even while some of the signatories are being held as political prisoners and are languishing in jail. There's also the Tripura Indigenous Tribal Peoples Accords. 3 of them have been signed. The Kabi Accords, one of which will be signed very recently. In fact, in a few days' time, we expect it to be signed, according to media reports. We also have the Mizo Accords. We have the Naga Accords. There are numerous of these Naga Accords. More recently, in 2015, the Framework Agreement was signed with the NSC and IM. And in 2017, an agreed position was signed with the Naga national political groups. None of these have yielded any substantive ground to the justified demand for self-determination by the indigenous people of the Northeast. So which is why we have to continue to assert that as long as the right to self-determination is not recognized in its true sense by the government of India, violence and oppression will have to continue as its modus operandi. We therefore have to continue to urge the government of India to honor its statements in letter, but more importantly, in spirit. The indigenous people are being integrated into a system that leaves us disarticulated socially and economically, and locking us into an unjust hierarchy and impoverishing us, even in terms of substantive needs. The Northeast indigenous people remain amongst the least developed in the country and are amongst the most marginalized communities. According to the latest government data from 2019, it's the NFHS data, round 5, if you're interested. The scheduled tribes face more malnutrition and stunting amongst children than any other social category, pointing to the rise in food insecurity in the region. Within the region itself, we witness greater inequality and social divides in the region, with chaotic growth and concentration in few urban areas and continued neglect of the rural populace. So it seems that the more attention the government of India directs towards the region, the worse the conditions of the people in the region become. systemic contradictions are being created and nurtured, turning each indigenous community in Northeast in line with the center and be more geared towards its needs rather than the genuine historically situated and internally dictated needs of the region, thus leading to further contradictions between the needs of the people and the present character of development. The role of the policies implemented by the state and its institutions cannot be understated in this process. This current trajectory is leading the Northeast region into a period where the people and the state are being fractured. Ever more signing of accords has replaced genuine dialogue with people, even while the draconian and colonial era AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, is extended, and the omnipresent military occupies the minds and public spaces in the region. Genuine dialogue amongst the people of the region has also decreased over the recent years, leading to a weakening of solidarity. So which is why we have to reassert the need for self-determination of all people as a prerequisite for just peace and progress in the region. Very briefly, if I would put it into 3 points, I would say point number 1, colonial legacies left over from British India continue to be the wellspring that shapes the attitude, ideas, and policies that form the relationship between the government of India and the Northeast region located at its periphery. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act is just one such result. It is only old wine in a new bottle. Secondly, on the part of the government of India, this leads to a two-sided relationship, with one side that is more covert and founded on distrust and coercion of people it considers lesser citizens, while on the other side, it displays an overt eagerness to claim the lands, resources, and access to markets of the region. Thirdly, more recently, there has been a pronounced emphasis in certain ideas that inform the policymakers and politicians of the government of India, which also contribute to these failures and will continue to do so unless rectified. Namely, on one hand, the marketization of various spheres of life in the belief that this will lead automatically to the betterment of human life. And on the other hand, the explicit state intervention in markets that's being witnessed in markets as well as infrastructural projects in favor of big capital, which will leave indigenous people and their lands vulnerable.
Okay. Thank you, Akam, for sharing your views on that. You have shared the issues of structural problems that remains unresolved, and that the negotiations are not actually negotiated on equal terms, but appears to be more of an imposition, and therefore not leading to any kind of a genuine solution, where the historical injustices remains unaddressed starting from the colonial times and even now. So the problems over resources, land, economic development, etc., remains a major contradiction. And then therefore, political conflict and militarization continues in spite of the 14 accords, as you mentioned, that already exist in the region. So given this context, Akam, what I would like to ask you is, what kind of recommendations would you like to give to the EMRIP or governments so that there is a meaningful dialogue facilitating genuine political solutions between the states and indigenous peoples in Northeast India?
We are thankful that the EMRIP provides various such mechanisms. I'll just point out 2 and make a small comment. So the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, EMRIP, and the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights, our recommendation would be that they undertake a study on the peace accords that are happening, including the peace negotiation between the government of India and the Nagas, along with all the other indigenous people in the Northeast region, in order to understand the situation and promote dialogue at the local level, as well as at the level of the United Nations, to advance the rights to self-determination and autonomy of indigenous peoples in the region. Secondly, that the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people and the permanent forum and the special rapporteur rights of indigenous peoples should facilitate an inclusive process aimed at the development of guiding principles for the realization and implementation of the right to self-determination and autonomy based on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and universal human rights standards in Northeast India. Regarding principles,
consolidate and send it.
Am I audible?
Yes,
yeah?
Please continue.
And regarding the principles, the need for transformative change leading to the betterment of the lives of all people should be recognized, but which would entail that the principles of cooperation and solidarity be observed by all parties. That is, firstly, that interactions be consciously guided by respect for all parties, and that the concerns and interests expressed by all parties be imbued with conscionable spirit. And secondly, that all parties acknowledge and be mindful of the role of historically acquired power in shaping a discourse, and abstain from resorting to such structural advantages that have accumulated, as this would derail our worthy attempts at collective action. Thank you, Gyan.
Thank you, Akam. I think those are also very valid and important recommendations that you have provided to all of us. Now we'll move on to our third panel. Our next speaker is Beverly Longit. She is the International Solidarity Officer of Katribu, which is the National Alliance of Indigenous Peoples organization in the Philippines. And she is also the Executive Council member of AIPP. So Beverly, welcome. And I would like to ask you this question. That in the Philippines, we have this Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, which is said to be one of the most progressive laws in Asia. And then you also have this National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, which was set up with the primary responsibility for protecting and implementing the provisions of this act, which includes right to their ancestral domains, self-governance, and empowerment. However, indigenous peoples have consistently expressed that their discontent over its implementation. So can you explain why this is so? Or can you share some of the key enabling conditions that are missing and that needs to be addressed for the meaningful implementation of this act? Beverly, please take the floor.
Thank you, Gam. Good afternoon to all of our participants and fellow speakers in this afternoon's webinar. Thank you for the organizers for involving us in this. This is the 24th year of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in the Philippines. And as you said, unfortunately, despite 24 years, several reports and complaints would validate the fact that the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, in collaboration with corporations, have violated the right of free, prior, informed consent and the self-determination of indigenous peoples in the Philippines. These they have done through manipulating the process, either through deception, coercion, without the full disclosure of necessary information in relation to projects or activities that will be implemented in indigenous peoples' territories. Unfortunately, the IPRA, or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, has become an instrument of dispossession for indigenous peoples in the Philippines. So there are several examples. At the height of the COVID pandemic last year, big mines like Oceana Gold, this is an Australian company, operated with an expired license. And then just yesterday, the Philippine government renewed its financial technical assistance agreement despite community protests. In other words, there was no clear consent in relation to the project, but there was an ongoing protest. In fact, a barricade has been set up to more or less minimize the operations of OceanaGold. Likewise, government goes on with the construction of several energy projects, also being opposed by affected communities, primarily indigenous peoples like the Halaur, Kaliwa Kanan, and Chico River dams. And these protests have resulted in the militarization of protesting communities and also escalated the attacks against indigenous peoples. Of course, with militarization would come violation of human rights. What I am saying now is supported, as I mentioned, by several studies and reports that have been either submitted to formal institutions nationally and globally. Second, the law provides or awards a so-called certificate of ancestral land or domain titles to indigenous peoples as proof of recognizing our rights to ancestral land. However, the process of awarding such titles is, how do you say this, is very costly, it's very expensive, it's very tedious, and the process actually is quite difficult to follow. In many cases, this resulted to the awarding of such certificates has resulted to community disunity, with the National Commission awarding titles to scrupulous individuals who now negotiate or deal with companies without the knowledge and consent of the entire community. Likewise, we have also have reports and wherein communities are also disunited because of the issue of the sharing of the meager royalties with regards to projects that are already ongoing. So the NCIP, the National Commission, has now created what we call tribal dealers instead of developing the capacities of tribal leaders. Now, third point, I think, in relation to the law, well, of course, there are also administrative limitations within the National Commission. It is ill-equipped in terms of capable and dedicated staff, and probably resources on how to implement its mandate. But nonetheless, despite even with such administrative limitations, what is worse at present is that the Commission has now also become an active instrument in the escalating attacks against indigenous peoples. It is at the core of the current government of the Duterte's counterinsurgency program. The chairman of the commission, retired General Alan Kapuyan, is the executive director of this National Task Force to End Communist Armed Conflict. And this task force is funded by several billions of pesos, and it is responsible for widespread misinformation, red tagging, defamation, and terrorist branding of indigenous peoples. Many of us, of our colleagues, are not with us today because either they have been killed or they are jailed due to criminal and other trump-up charges. And in fact, with the anti-terrorism law enacted by this government, the first that have been charged under this law are indigenous peoples who remain in jail despite the intervention of the commission to have the charges dropped. And very recently, and this is quite alarming, the commission itself has issued resolutions banning the use of the term lumad for the indigenous peoples of Mindanao because according to them, this is a term being used by the underground revolutionary movement, and a similar resolution was also issued by the commissioner for Cordillera and for the Cordillera, wherein he claims that the terms Igorot, Tumandok, and Lumad are also terms of the armed revolutionary movement. So now we see a distortion of the true and simple meaning of the terms and undermines the right to self-identity of the indigenous Igorots, Lumads, and Tumandok. So now we have a commission dedicated for Indigenous peoples, but who has a lack of understanding of our history and our struggle. And this is also another form of red tagging, and it has serious consequences. So in other words, 24 years of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, 24 years of the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, we see a failure to promote and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, not only in terms of land, but now in terms of other civil and political rights. We look at it that this commission now embodies the political misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. So probably my last point. So what are the lessons that we learned, no, with having an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act and a National Commission on Indigenous Peoples? I think one, the enactment of a law that is positively or progressively written, recognizing Indigenous people's rights, and a creation of an institution for the implementation of such is not enough. You know? We live in a country wherein Indigenous law and state law are currently irreconcilable. There are opposing views on ownership, land acquisition, use, and management. And then, of course, still, the state laws operate under the Regalian Doctrine. And also, the IPRA contradicts other existing laws. So it is not enough that we have these laws or we have these institutions, but also a better understanding that I think the genuine achievement of recognition of rights to land and self-determination really takes time. It's a continuous process, and it would involve it would need the active involvement of Indigenous peoples and friends of Indigenous peoples. But this is not to say that we should not strive to achieve victories, no matter how small, because all of this would ultimately contribute to the recognition of Indigenous peoples and our rights and welfare. So that's the way I would look at IPRA.
Okay, thank you, Beverly, for sharing your views on the IPRA, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. Well, you have shared that how this IPRA actually has been turned into an instrument of dispossession and used against Indigenous peoples. And even more unfortunately is that the specific institutions the National Commission created to really undertake this for effective implementation is now going against Indigenous peoples in many ways. Apart from other things that you have shared about the procedural and rule problems and how tedious, expensive it is even to get your certificate or titles to this ancestral domain and so on. So in this context, I'm just wondering whether this IPRA can still be used in favor of Indigenous peoples. And if that is the case, because you have suggested that having a good law itself is not enough. So you seem to be indicating to other things that needs to be done, especially enabling conditions, whether it's political, structural, legal aspects that goes along with a good law. That seems to be what you're suggesting. So in that context, what would be your recommendations to the EMRIP and to the governments? Yes, for that, in terms of looking at the way forward for us.
Well, I think one, as far as how the law was implemented or how the law operated for the last 24 years, this would call for a review of such law and be able to look into identify what are the areas needing reforms as far as the implementation. And as in relation to the commission, I hope that the governments would also support this to look into reforming the commission itself to be able to serve and protect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Probably since EMRIP is involved in studies, the results and recommendations arising from this review can be shared with others to guide either ongoing or future efforts in relation to drafting laws and the creation of institutions for Indigenous peoples. Maybe second point, in a situation of extreme attacks and repression, it's really difficult, or we cannot talk of enjoying rights to land and self-determination under such a context. So specifically on the Philippines, we would like to call on the governments and maybe EMRIP to support our continuing call for the UN Human Rights Council to conduct independent investigation on the human rights situation in the Philippines, especially on intensifying attacks against indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, taking note that the counterinsurgency policy of government focuses on indigenous peoples because they claim that rebel areas are found in indigenous peoples' territories, and also to support CSO, civil society-led initiatives to do the same. Maybe for a last point, in furtherance to addressing self-determination, land rights, and peace, several indigenous peoples, especially in Asia, are in areas of conflict, conflict and at the same time fragility. And it might also be worthwhile to look into studies or conduct studies or support dialogues in relation to self-determination, development, and peace, looking also in the participation of indigenous peoples in existing national peace processes. In the case of the Philippines, we would like to call for a support for the formal resumption of peace negotiations between the government and the revolutionary forces as a way to address the causes of conflict, including those of indigenous peoples. I think those will be some of the recommendations I can forward at this time.
Thank you, Beverly, for those very concrete and also very important recommendations that you have put forward. So now we'll move on to the next speaker. But before I call on to the next speaker, who will be the last one in this panel, I just want to remind everyone that we will have a few minutes of rounds of discussions of Q&A. So I can see that some are already posting the questions. So if you're interested to raise some questions, please put it in the chat box which will follow after this next speaker. So now our next speaker is Kay Jung. He is an indigenous human rights defender from Myanmar. He also is the director of the Indigenous Peoples Partnership. So Kay Jung, I would also like to ask you this question. As many would claim that the participation of indigenous peoples in the so-called democratic transition, as well as the peace processes, were precarious and fragile because of fundamental flaws in the processes as well as in the constitution itself. Now, in this context, I would like to ask you, what do you make of the current developments following the coup on 1st February this year? And what do you think are the pathways in potentially creating a democratic Myanmar where indigenous peoples are also fully included and are enjoying the right to self-determination? Kay Jung, please take the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Game, for and also organizer for this important event. Well, looking at the current situation in Myanmar, and as again you mentioned about peace process, including a recent military coup which took place on 1st February, I think it is important and also necessary to look back the past histories, why all the historical impacts have pushed us into these current scenarios. As we all know, Burma was a union formed with Hill peoples, in agreement of Hill people, which is indigenous peoples and proper Burmas, and agreement of we call it the Panlong Agreement in 1948, which was signed in Shan State. But later on, that lack of implementation of that agreement, the agreement which promised full self-determination of indigenous people, and also equality and political equal right in Myanmar was not implemented. And therefore, due to lack of implementation, along with the first military coup in 1962, have actually pushed indigenous people to become a kind of another struggle class, and also leading to the armed conflict since 1962. And along with that, the term self-determinations and also the self-determination struggles of indigenous peoples have been portrayed as anti-national movements or anti-union elements. And it became a key reason for a military to crack down on indigenous peoples movement in Myanmar, which have caused more than 60 years civil war in Myanmar. And yet, after more than 40 years of living under military rule, and military have dropped this constitution in 2008, and then first election was held in 2010, and through that democratization, a nationwide ceasefire agreement, which is a single tax ceasefire agreement, was signed in 2015, which have actually give a space for indigenous peoples and militaries and also other key political stakeholders to have a kind of dialogue and negotiation to shape how the country of Myanmar should be. Yet, after more than 5 years of discussion and implementation, even in the process of signing nationwide ceasefire agreement itself was kind of so divisive in structure and also in approach. More than 20 ethnic armed group or indigenous armed group have been struggling for self-determination in Myanmar for more than for many decades, but only 10 groups have managed to sign the nationwide ceasefire agreements and held Union Peace Conference, or we call it the 21st Panlong Conference. However, the Union Peace Agreement that we have in Myanmar was not really inclusive, and also the rights of indigenous people were not included because it's also approached from the top-down approach, and which have actually disenfranchised participation of indigenous peoples in Myanmar. And of course, the nationwide ceasefire agreement somehow was a kind of ingredient for democratizations and also national reconciliations, which we were somehow hopeful that that will enhance negotiation between indigenous peoples and proper Burma. However, with the current recent experience of military coup, have again backslide the whole process that which we have achieved in the last 5 years. In fact, what we have achieved in the last 5 years is not enough because earlier, as I said, because of the top-down approach, but somehow there was a kind of a space that where we still can engage and hoping that it will be a way through. However, within current context, we are very uncertain about the futures because we have lived under military rule for the more than 40 years in the past, and it is not a solution. We know it, and the current situation is not a solution for the struggle of indigenous people as well as for democratization in Myanmar itself, and which the solution that we are looking for, military will not be able to provide. And therefore, the current democratization process is important to enhance the discussion of self-determination for the indigenous peoples in Myanmar. I think, again, this is something that I can bring on the current context of a nationwide ceasefire and also the coup. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kejung, for explaining the context and all along how indigenous peoples were not fully included. And particularly, you also referred to the peace agreements where only 10 groups were part of the process. So in this context, Kejung, my question would be that what would you be the kind of recommendations that you would be giving to EMRIP or to the UN to ensure that indigenous peoples are also recognized as equal right holders in the creation of a democratic state of Myanmar? Because now we have this situation where all the process has broken down, but then there is an emerging trend. And in this process, how can indigenous peoples also be included as equal right holders in the creation of a new democratic state of Myanmar?
Again, thank you. My recommendation to EMRIP will be at the current political stalemate in Myanmar. In this context, international community play a key role to dissolve current crisis that include UN agencies. And we also know that the democratization which we have experienced in the last 5 years through top-down approach and through the image of State Councillor Do Aung San Suu Kyi is not the answer. And rather such kind of approach that which international community have applauded for the last 5 years is actually reversely, in reverse case, is very been, harmful to indigenous communities, which have actually pushed away indigenous people from the process. Therefore, the EMRIP, including UN agencies, should engage in the engineering, the whole dissolving political stalemate in Myanmar should be, EMRIP should engage to assert that there should be there should be a recognition of indigenous peoples, which state constitutions and even the approach have not recognized yet. Therefore, unless such a recognition is arrived at the tables, it will be extremely difficult to resolve the current political stalemate as well as achieving sustainable peace. And second recommendation is that in the process of nation building process, which might likely to happen after some time, I think it is important to prepare EMRIP to how they can engage with the state as well as other political stakeholders, including militaries and also civil society organization in Myanmar, to recognize the identity of indigenous peoples in Myanmar. Sometimes it become a conflict in Myanmar, and therefore I think international concept and understanding is required, and which need to be included in the process of nation building and national reconciliation in Myanmar, where EMRIP, of course, can still can play very key role engaging and bridging the civil society and different political stakeholders in the process.
Thank you, Kejung, for sharing those recommendations. I think very important. And I think, yes, we do take note that indigenous peoples need to be included, and that should be one of the pressures being created by the UN systems and international community. So thank you. Now we have ended with the panel's discussion. What we'll do now is we will share a short video from Leonardo Alvarado. He's the special attorney of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Repertory on the rights of indigenous peoples. So this message is about the report that they're working on preparing in terms of the processes with reference to the right of self-determination in Latin America. So yes, we will have a 6 minutes video message from Leonardo. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Leonardo Alvarado, a specialist attorney at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Repertory on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. On behalf of the Commission and its chair on Repertory and Indigenous Peoples, Antonio Rejola, I would like to give a special greeting and thanks to the organizers of this event, including the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, the Diplomacy Training Institute, and the Indigenous Peoples Human Rights Defenders Network. As way of background, the Office of the Repertory of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of the Inter-American Commission was created in 1990 to provide attention to the indigenous peoples of the hemisphere and to strengthen, promote, and systematize the Commission's work in this area. Through various forums, hearings, visits, and in the general monitoring by the Commission, indigenous and tribal peoples have requested the support of international human rights bodies, including the Commission, to reaffirm and promote the right to self-determination. Therefore, in 2020, the Commission decided to prepare a thematic report on the right of self-determination of indigenous and tribal peoples, currently being drafted. The report has the objective to clarify and elaborate on the international standards related to self-determination of indigenous and tribal peoples, and to establish the Inter-American Commission's definitive position and to consolidate it within inter-American human rights law. The report will address the sources of this right and its different elements or manifestations, including models of indigenous autonomy and self-government, indigenous justice and jurisdiction, political participation and election of authorities, consultation and consent protocols, among others. Good practices, experiences, and challenges in the exercise of self-determination in the different countries of the Americas will be included. It will seek to make these practices and experiences visible so that they could serve as positive models for indigenous and tribal peoples in other states and regions. It will also include recommendations to the states for the recognition and realization of this right. A particular focus of the report is also incorporating indigenous and tribal peoples' own views of what is self-determination and how to bring it about. As part of the process of preparation of the report, the Inter-American Commission circulated an online questionnaire to indigenous and tribal peoples organizations, states, civil society organizations, academic institutions, and other actors in the Americas, all of whom were invited to provide information regarding the experiences, challenges, practices, legislation, and jurisprudence related to the recognition and exercise of self-determination in their respective countries. Due to the pandemic, the Inter-American Commission held a series of virtual events to gather information for the report. This included a virtual meeting with experts in international law and indigenous peoples. In addition, a series of regional working meetings were also held with indigenous and tribal representatives, experts, jurists, and academics from South America, Central America, Mexico, United States, and the Caribbean. In addition, thematic group meetings were also held on issues such as indigenous autonomous governments, issues affecting transboundary indigenous peoples, legal pluralism, and the concerns of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. In all, 11 virtual meetings took place in preparation of this report. Both the responses to the questionnaire received and the participation in the regional forums were very successful in that a great deal of information was received and that was representative of every main region of the Americas. Representatives from indigenous and tribal peoples and their institutions and organizations were very interested in sharing their experiences regarding self-determination initiatives, proposals, and recommendations. The level of participation by indigenous and tribal peoples through the responses to the questionnaires and participation in the virtual meetings was among the highest for a report by the Commission. In that sense, the conditions imposed by the pandemic and the need to hold virtual events actually facilitated this greater participation, despite difficulties still faced by many indigenous peoples in accessing internet and related technologies. We are currently still reviewing, processing, and incorporating all the information received as part of the ongoing drafting of the report, which we are working to publish at the end of the year. The information so far confirms that despite the recognition of indigenous people's rights to autonomy and self-determination at the international level and at domestic level in the constitutions and legislations in some countries of the region like Bolivia, Mexico, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Colombia, indigenous peoples still face challenges in being able to exercise this right in practice. In some states, there are tensions and divergences between indigenous peoples and states in the understanding of the content and scope of this right. In other cases, the exercise of this right is limited by the lack of adequate resources for the development and functioning of indigenous autonomous institutions and initiatives, or by the interests of governments and other external actors seeking access to lands and natural resources on indigenous territories for development projects or illegal activities. Violence and criminalization of indigenous peoples defending their right is another great challenge. In some states, there are problems associated with the lack of recognition of indigenous and tribal people as such, which presents problems when demanding their collective rights. Despite these obstacles, indigenous peoples maintain their desire to determine their own destinies and pursue their economic, social, and cultural development in coexistence with states and national societies. And it is important that states and other interested actors work together with indigenous peoples through coordinated and systematic actions to recognize and implement indigenous peoples' rights, including self-determination initiatives. We look forward to completing the report and sharing its findings and recommendations in and outside of the Americas. I want to thank you again for this opportunity to share this experience and to speak about this important report. Thank you.
Even though Leonardo is not able to be with us because of the time difference, we shall very much send our gratitude to him after this webinar. It's a very important initiative that is being undertaken in Latin America, and that is the reason that we needed to also hear from what is being done on that side of the world. As Beverly also was mentioning, that having a law is not enough. Much more needs to be done. And this is some of the institutional efforts that is being made by the American Human Rights, American Commission on Human Rights. And this is something that we could also aspire for in Asia, which unfortunately is not there yet, but something that we could learn from and have more exchanges. So thank you all for listening. Now we'll go to the Q&A session. I think we have around maximum 10 minutes, unfortunately. Looking through the chat box, there are a few questions. Let me start by asking Beverly. This is from Natalie. It says, thank you, Beverly, for sharing the bleak reality of the EPRA's non-implementation in the Philippines. Can you say more about the institutional setup, that is the National Commission, and in particular, what is its composition? For example, if Indigenous peoples are well represented or not. Beverly, can you briefly answer this question?
Yes, thank you, Natalie. The National Commission is an office directly under the Office of the President, and it is composed of 7 commissioners, roughly representing the geographic areas wherein we have a relatively concentrated or high population of Indigenous peoples. Among the 7, one is the chairperson. All of them are indigenous, and they are appointed by the president. So in terms of participation of the selection process, it's really negligible as far as the say of Indigenous peoples, because it is an appointed position. And probably one of the lessons that we've learned with the setting up of the National Commission is that it is not enough that one is Indigenous people to say that he will really work or stand for IP rights, Indigenous people's rights and welfare. In the case of the NCIP, unfortunately, they have worked against Indigenous peoples, or probably there are some that are honest to goodness, are for Indigenous people's rights, but since it works in a system that is largely controlled by the executive, nothing really is being done. I mean, that's it in terms of its composition and setup. And supposedly, it has the mandate to protect and serve the interests of Indigenous peoples, facilitate the process of FPIC, and then, if so warrants, would be issuing this so-called certificate of ancestral domain or ancestral land titles.
Thank you, Beverly. This is a common question which any of the panels could take it on if you would like to. It says it's a common scenario that states are not implementing the accords properly signed with Indigenous peoples. In this situation, what can the international community such as EMRIP, Permanent Forum, and other pressure groups could do for its full implementation? It's a general question. Of course, this is something that we look forward in our recommendations as well. But would any of the panel, would you like to take it on, this question? If the panels are not, then can I maybe request Lola or Patrick, because you are working in the international front. So it's really addressing it to international communities, meaning both the CSOs as well as these mechanisms.
Can you repeat the question, Dan? Sorry.
Okay, the question is that it's a common scenario that this accord signed with indigenous peoples are not implemented worldwide. So what can the international communities do, including like the EMRIP, Permanent Forum, etc., so that these accords or agreements can be fully implemented?
Yeah. I don't know, Patrick, if you want to go first.
I wish I had a nice, easy answer for the question.
Yeah.
But I think it's true of all of our work that we are dealing with human rights agreements, human rights standards that governments have adopted. They volunteered to sign them. They have taken them, put them into law, but then we see they're not implemented. We see they're not implemented by the constant violations of human rights in all areas and in all countries. So the answer has to be in building the political will for implementation, and that means organizing and solidarity and campaigning and thinking creatively about how we can use the institutions that have been established to uphold and implement the law. And these human rights standards are minimum standards. There shouldn't be aspirations. They shouldn't be. They should be the floor, not the ceiling. And they are now. They have been with us for some time. So I think we have to think, as the questioner suggests, how do we use EMRIP, the Permanent Forum, other forums, to bring pressure to bear, to have dialogue, to think through solutions. And this can take time, and we don't know when the breakthroughs will happen. But I think here, for example, in Australia, there is now a growing understanding of the role of Indigenous peoples as custodians of the land. There is a recognition of traditional knowledge, and that unless we respect that traditional knowledge, we will all suffer. And so that's taken a very long period of struggle to get the main society to understand and recognize the value of Indigenous peoples' knowledge. And I think there are perhaps lessons from that struggle that can be shared, that may have relevance elsewhere. There is solidarity that can be built, but it is partly just through consistent perseverance work that we try and find ways forward, and we remind governments, we remind companies that these are the standards that apply to them. These are the laws that apply. If they value the rule of law, these are the laws that apply to them that they've taken on. And so I think it is our role in civil society, in people's movements, in organizations, to continue maintaining that and to find ways to move the agenda forward and to use the spaces that are available to us, such as EMRIP, Permanent Forum, UN Human Rights Council, to use mechanisms like the UN Special Procedures. So I think we can learn from each other how to do that effectively, and this forum is a really valuable way of doing that too. Thank you.
Cam, I would just add or stress, I fully agree with Patrick. Of course, the international community, the UN, the mechanism have a limited power. If you can say the UN does not have power as such over states, but at the same time, states have signed some international treaties and agreements regarding their obligation to protect and to respect human rights. And this is what the international community, the UN, has to call upon all the states. They have obligations. They have themselves signed to these obligations. But and they can do that. And what the UN mechanism dealing with Indigenous people's rights is putting Indigenous people's rights in that context. is putting Indigenous people's rights, or the protection of Indigenous people's rights, in the context of the obligation of states to international human rights treaties. It's not only about the declaration, if it is legally binding, not legally binding. No, international human rights treaties, in which the UN Declaration is based, create obligation to states. As Patrick said, it's a long process. It's a long process that demands cooperation, alliance, solidarity among many, many different actors. And not only within the UN and external the UN, I think in that sense, it's very, very important that as Patrick said, not only the UN mechanism dealing with Indigenous people's rights, other relevant human rights mechanisms should work much more in cooperation and together with regard to monitoring and putting pressure on states on their respect and the protection of Indigenous people's rights.
Thank you, Lola. We are almost out of time. So I hope that even though some of the questions remain unanswered, I hope you will forgive me for that, because I am the one at fault here, not being able to manage the time well. Now, I think because of time, I think it's very important that we go to some of these conclusions and some of the recommendations that we're thinking of submitting to the EMRIP at least. So this, but before that, I just want to say, I will not come back and take the floor to save time. I think the important thing that we have shared, that not just law is enough, but how the law can be effective. There are many things to be done along with that. And that is what is perhaps missing. That is kind of reforms and structural changes that are needed for improvement for the sake of peace and justice. I think that is the message that is coming very clear, at least that's what I hear. And also, as I was saying in the beginning, the intent and the spirit of why this UN declaration came about, it has this historical context. And therefore, it has initiated the moral reform in the international human rights standard settings, as well as there has been reform initiated in terms of the structure within the UN, and it is going on. But this same process is not done with equal seriousness, or has been ignored by most states in terms of this reform that is needed at the national level to really translate this into practice and give meaning for peace and justice for the whole society. You know, I think that's really one of the issues, and that's what we need to continue to push collectively, as also shared by Patrick and Lola and others as well. So without wasting much more time, I would give the floor to give us some of the conclusions and the recommendations that we would like to put forward, and then followed by Patrick to give the closing remark on behalf of the organizers of this webinar. From my side, thank you, all of you, especially the participants and the panelists and everybody who has taken the trouble and the pain to organize and make this webinar a success. So Lola, please take the floor, followed by Patrick. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cam, and thank you very much to all speakers for their important statements and recommendations. As expressed by all UN mechanisms dealing with Indigenous people's rights, the right to self-determination is a foundational right without which Indigenous people's human rights, both collective and individual, cannot be fully enjoyed. And as Pinota told us in the beginning of this event, this report that the EMRIP is considering during this session builds upon other studies that they have produced, which many of them refer to the issue of self-determination. But I think it's important also not to see only the whole issue of the argumentation of the UN mechanisms regarding the right to self-determination only in the context of EMRIP, but also in the context of also the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Special Rapporteur, which both mechanisms have also prepared very important reports on this topic. And just to mention, the Special Rapporteur has a report to the UN General Assembly on the rights of indigenous peoples to autonomy and self-government. And the Permanent Forum last year had also prepared a study on indigenous peoples' autonomies, experiences, and perspectives. And this show the focus, the enormous importance that the three mechanisms are now giving to the issue of how to advance on the recognition and the protection and the understanding also of the right, indigenous people's right to self-determination. All of these reports include a lot of recommendations, a lot of very practical recommendations to states, but also to other actors, to companies, to civil society, to indigenous peoples. So I think at the moment we have a quite coherent and substantive body of recommendations on how to move forward with the practical implementation and how to identify the enabling conditions. But however, very, very little has been done on that. And I think it's not the issue of the mechanism, is the will of the states. I think Patrick, when his response, how do we promote states, increase the will of states to move forward in that regard. And this is an enormous challenge and work ahead that us, but also all the mechanisms have in front. So based on the presentations today, and in order to contribute to the work of the EMRIP, and particularly presenting some concrete recommendations to them on how to move forward with the practical implementations and how to make change on the situation of indigenous peoples on the ground, I will put forward some of the recommendations. That the first one is to recommend the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples and the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights to undertake a study on the peace accords and reconciliation initiatives, including ongoing peace negotiation and reconciliation efforts, focusing on examining barriers and creating enabling conditions to promote constructive dialogue among states and indigenous peoples for advancing the rights to self-determination and autonomy in Asia. We would like to encourage the expert mechanism to actively collaborate with the Permanent Forum, the Special Rapporteur, to facilitate an inclusive process aimed at the development of guiding principles for the realization and implementation of the right to self-determination and autonomy based on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Universal Human Rights Standards, because the two main covenants of the UN in Article 1 recognize the right of peoples to self-determination. Meaningful and broad participation of indigenous peoples' organizations from Asia should be ensured in this process. The expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples and the Permanent Forum along the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights and the UN Department of Political and Peace-Building Affairs should facilitate regional and local level dialogues between indigenous peoples and states for the realization and implementation of the right to self-determination and autonomy. Many of the speakers today have referred to the importance of having the UN and using the UN mechanism and the UN system to really promote and facilitate dialogues between states and indigenous peoples with regard to self-determination, but also other issues were mentioned, particularly in situations of conflict, militarization, etc. We would like also to recommend EMRIP to co-organize an international technical seminar together with the UN Permanent Forum, the Special Rapporteur, and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights that Leonardo has explained to us about their efforts to promote respect and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination in the American, and to jointly analyze the recommendations made in the very many reports that the different mechanisms have presented, in order to develop a common roadmap that can guide their work and collaboration to advance in the practical implementation of this crucial right. I think the EMRIP alone won't be able to do much. I think we have these 3 UN mechanisms dealing with Indigenous peoples' rights, but there are other mechanisms also that they are very relevant. Particularly, I can mention the Working Group on Business and Human Rights and others. But I think it's very, very important that they could sit together with Indigenous peoples and identify what can we do together? How do we use our mandate in the best possible way and develop a kind of roadmap that somehow could help them together to push the states. And finally, I think one of the recommendations, I think in order to implement at country level, to move forward also at country level with other actors, is that to recommend EMRIP to convene a dialogue with the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions with a view to making recommendations to states and their national human rights institutions or ombudsman institutions on best practices and lessons learned in promoting and implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and processes related to realize the right to self-determination. So I think this will cover more or less some of the recommendations that have been presented here at different levels by the speakers. But if any of you have any further recommendation, please submit it to Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. The idea is that these recommendations will be submitted in writing to the EMRIP tomorrow. So thank you very much all, and thank you very much the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact for leading the organization of this important event. Please, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lola. And I promise not to keep you all very long. Just really, I think it's been left for me to say thank you very much to Lola for bringing the proceedings, this forum, to a very practical end with those recommendations. It's, I think, a good way to finish a discussion is to look very positively and practically at what needs to be done. And we shouldn't just talk, but we need to look at what action is needed. And that's a very practical set of recommendations there. And it's a work in progress too, as Lola said. So if there are other things that you feel should be taken forward from this discussion, then please send them into AIPP. I thank Gam and his colleagues at AIPP and AIPP for inviting the Diplomacy Training Programme to partner in this important forum and workshop side event at EMRIP. And I join you from Sydney. I'm here on Indigenous peoples' land. I'm here on the land of the Aboriginal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present, recognise the struggles that they are still involved in to achieve self-determination and recognition for their rights as Indigenous peoples here. So it's very relevant to the discussions here. I think what I've heard most strongly come through is a relationship in today's discussion between human rights and peace, and that you don't have sustainable peace without recognition and realization of human rights. And the drafters of the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and of the UN Charter understood the relationship between human rights and peace and the importance of the right to self-determination as a human right and as the right of peoples. And I think they were wise to do so. Unfortunately, we have to constantly go back to that wisdom and remind governments of that relationship. I think we can really achieve change only by finding ways to work together, to collaborate, to build solidarity, and to yes, to remind ourselves of the values that are so important to our world, that bind us together. And if we find ways to learn from each other, to act together, then we can make progress. And I thank everybody involved in this session for the contributions of the excellent speakers who inform us from the ground, and also of the people who've contributed through the chat room. So the conversations continue, the work continues, and we look forward to being there and working with you going forward. But thank you, Gam, and everyone else. Lola. Have a good evening, a good day, a good night from here. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye, 30 seconds to say thank you.
Bye, everyone.